The Queen Who Rode with the Dead Part 2. Chapter 9, The Return with Fire. The ship that carried her back to England hit no storms. But the rats drowned in their cages overnight, and the sails never stopped creaking, not once, not even in still wind. Isabella stood alone at the bow, veil drawn tight, unmoving. She did not sleep during the journey. No one saw her eat. The captain, a man of battle and salt, refused to look her in the eyes. When they docked, he was seen burning his boots before ever stepping ashore. At the London harbour, the guards did not announce her. She walked off the ship barefoot. The hem of her gown was damp with something that left no footprint, only a slight discoloration, as if the earth where she stepped blanched. Her carriage was waiting, but she ignored it. She walked the streets on foot. No escort. No herald. The people parted. Some knelt. Some crossed themselves. One child tried to hand her a flower. It wilted in his hand before he reached her. He burst into tears and said, "She has no eyes." He wasn't wrong. Her eyes never quite closed. At night, the maid swore she stared at the ceiling, unblinking, lips slightly parted as if listening. When they blinked, her gaze was elsewhere. When they turned away, they could still feel it. One girl left her service the same night she entered. She claimed she heard whispering, from the Queen's eyes. As if they weren't hers anymore. As if someone else was using them to look back. She hung herself in the laundry courtyard. In court, the Queen spoke gently. She smiled. Her words were sweet, formal, measured. But people began to cough when she entered. Flowers in the great hall turned brown in their vases. Books cracked at their bindings. Ink ran dry in the wells. One nobleman, trying to kiss her hand, burst a blood vessel in his eye. Another vomited feathers after shaking her glove. She apologized both times. With a smile. Edward noticed nothing. Or rather, he refused to. His eyes had gone glassy, his mouth slightly slack. He wore gold even in his sleep now, muttering about eternal kingship, about thrones that floated and never touched the ground. He spoke only to Gaveston. And to the Virgin Mary, though only in mirrors. Sometimes he slapped them. Sometimes he cried. Isabella spent her nights in the chapel crypt. She claimed to be meditating. One priest followed her once. He found her kneeling in the dark before a basin filled with melted wax and something red. Her fingers were submerged. She turned slowly and said, "I'm washing away everything that made me small." He left the abbey that night and became a flagellant. He walked to Canterbury on his knees and died 6 days later with the word, silence, carved into his tongue. She touched no flame. But fire followed her. Curtains curled at the edges after she passed. Ink on scrolls bubbled without heat. A servant caught her reflection in the silver tea tray and claimed it didn't match her movements, it was too slow, like it was deciding whether or not to follow. He was later found convulsing in the stables, mouth filled with ashes. Edward III, her son, began to stare at her strangely. Not with love. Not with fear. With recognition. He said nothing. But when he was alone, he practiced speaking in front of the mirror, as if preparing for a language he hadn't learned yet. One night, he woke screaming. "She's not breathing. She's remembering." No one knew what it meant. Except Isabella. She smiled when she heard it. Chapter 10, The Whispering Throne. It did not happen all at once. Gaveston was not dragged. He was peeled from Edward's side like rot from fruit. There had been whispers for months. Nobles furious. Churchmen outraged. Soldiers unpaid, mocked, displaced. They called him the canker on the rose. They said he ruled in soft silks while the kingdom bled. But it wasn't politics that ended him. It was Isabella. She said nothing. She didn't need to. One night, during a banquet, she raised her goblet and offered a single toast to absence, the only thing that lets us see clearly. Gaveston choked on his wine. Within days, he was arrested. Within weeks, he was dead. Beheaded on Blacklow Hill. His head sent to Edward wrapped in silk. The king howled like an animal. Tore at his robes. Refused food. Refused counsel. He locked himself in the throne room for 3 days. Isabella did not knock. She sat in the garden and watched the ravens gather. She did not cry. She did not sleep. She simply waited. And when Edward finally emerged, pale, trembling, eyes swollen and full of silence, she kissed his cheek and said, "Now you can see me again." But the throne had changed him. Something about those 3 days in the dark, with no one but that ancient chair of oak and blood-soaked velvet, had hollowed him. He began to speak less. Blink less. Eat only white food, bread, milk, eggs. He said color was too loud. He ordered the court tapestries removed. Too busy. Too many eyes. And then he started asking questions. Not about his kingdom, but about his reflection. Have you ever noticed how the throne doesn't reflect? I sat in it, and I could feel her breathing behind me. Who sat there before me, really? Servants whispered that the throne was haunted. Not by Gaveston, but by something older. Something that stirred the very moment Gaveston's blood hit the soil. They said the armrests moved slightly when no one Saturday. That the velvet always felt wet. That if you sat too long, you'd feel something tapping under the cushion. Once, the Queen stood near the dais alone. She reached out, just barely, and touched the wood. A pulse. Faint. Like something dreaming just below the surface. The whispers began that night. At first faint, inaudible, ignorable. A trick of the stone. The wind. But Isabella knew better. She would walk the throne room after midnight. Alone. And the voices would begin. They did not speak words at first, only her name. Softly. Drawn out. Like breath on a fevered mouth. Isabella. The sound came from everywhere, and from nowhere. Not through ears. But through the walls. The guards heard nothing. But the crows began to circle the tower. On the third night, she whispered back. I hear you. The air stilled. And the voice answered. Then listen. That night, she dreamed of Gaveston. Not as he was, but as a puppet. His head dangled loosely from a string of sinew. His mouth stitched shut. His hands tied behind his back. He knelt before the throne and tried to scream, but blood poured from his ears instead. Isabella watched. And the lady stood beside her. Your silence is louder than his scream, the lady said. But it is not enough. The next morning, the throne room floor was covered in frost. No windows were open. No winter wind. Just a layer of rime across the stone, spelling, barely legible, a single word. Soon. The king began refusing to sit. He stood during audiences. Paced like a dog. Stared at corners. And sometimes, when he thought no one watched, he spoke to the empty chair. Isabella sat on it once. Just once. Late at night. Alone. The seat was still warm. The wood groaned beneath her, not from weight, but from recognition. And the voice returned. Not whispering now. Singing. A lullaby in a dead language. And when she stood, she found her handprints burned into the velvet. Just briefly. They faded. But not before she saw them, webbed. The Queen said nothing. But her shadow began to follow her a little slower than before. And when she looked in the mirror, she could see it lag, just slightly. As if it was no longer hers. But watching her, too. Chapter 11, Mortimer. He was a traitor. A prisoner. A man who had once served the king, and then spat at his boots. Now, he was nothing but a name spoken in fear and corners. Roger Mortimer. Of Wigmore. Of rebellion. Of the marches. Imprisoned for treason. Escaped under moonlight. Disappeared across the channel. And then, suddenly, he returned. Not to the king. To the queen. They met in secret. Not in chambers or chapels. In the old ossuary beneath the palace. Where dust sat like velvet and even the rats walked quietly. Isabella stood at the center of the room, cloaked in black, arms bare. The candlelight did not touch her skin, it curved away, like something repelled. When Mortimer entered, he did not kneel. He watched her in silence. Long. Appraising. Then he said, "They say you don't blink anymore." She smiled. "They say I'm not alone anymore." He stepped forward. Close. Too close for comfort. But not close enough for safety. He reached out, slowly. Not to touch her face, but her shadow, which seemed to pulse faintly on the stone behind her. He didn't flinch. "When I fled the tower, I prayed to something. Not to your God. Not mine. But something that watches from under the earth. I think it was listening." She didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him, slow, like smoke moving uphill, and placed something in his hand. A strip of cloth. Torn from Edward's coronation robe. Still crusted with dried wine. And blood. He keeps nothing sacred. Not vows. Not kingdom. Not wife. Mortimer held the cloth to his nose. Breathed deep. Then he kissed her hand. Not as a knight. Not as a lover. As an acolyte. The queen felt no pleasure in it. But she felt power. And more than that, she felt recognition. This was no courtly flirtation. This was a covenant. They met again, and again. In the catacombs. In ruined chapels. In a well that hadn't held water since the last crusade. He brought her maps. Lists of nobles. Letters of treason. Letters of loyalty. She brought him the name of a bishop whose wine had been poisoned. A lock of hair from Edward's youngest bastard. A jar filled with what he thought were marbles, until one of them blinked. Mortimer became a knife. She became the hand that held it. Together, they began to cut England open, not quickly, not loudly, but ritualistically. Land was taken. Alliances shifted. Loyalties grew wet and malleable. And in the background, the king whispered to himself. To his throne. To ghosts no one else could see. One night, Mortimer woke alone in the ossuary. He had fallen asleep after writing letters in the queen's presence. Now, she was gone. And something stood in the corner, tall, wrong-jointed, wearing her dress but not her face. It smiled with too many teeth. "You kissed her hand," it whispered. "Now you carry her dead." When he blinked, it was gone. But the bones beneath him had arranged themselves into a circle. And his name was written in ash at the center. The next time they met, Isabella looked into his eyes and asked, "Do you still think I'm just a woman?" Mortimer answered, "No. You are the opening of a door." Chapter 12, The Fox in the Garden. It began in spring. But nothing bloomed the way it should have. The hedges grew sharp. The fountains ran muddy. The crows stopped flying, and began to watch. And the roses bloomed black. Not dark red. Not purple. Black, like burnt silk. Like crow feathers soaked in ink. They didn't smell of flowers. They smelled of milk left in the mouth too long. It was Mortimer who noticed first. They lay together beneath the yew trees, bodies still warm, breaths sinking, clothes half scattered like pages from a burned book. And above them, a rose bush, impossibly tall, its thorns thick as thumbs. He reached to touch one. It bled. Not sap. Not dew. Blood. Warm. Real. Bright. He turned to Isabella, breath caught. You've changed the garden. She closed her eyes. Smiled. It's never truly been mine before. Their affair was not hidden. But it was not flaunted. Isabella no longer cared about courtly discretion. She walked differently now, not like a queen, but like a creature that belonged to no man, no crown, no church. She wore darker colors. Spoke in fewer words. Smiled like she already knew what you'd say, and had heard it in a dream, years ago. Servants began to leave food outside her chamber without knocking. Some claimed her shadow had changed shape, longer, sharper, with something coiled at its feet. And then came the fox. It was found at dawn in the royal gardens, beneath the queen's favorite arbor. Its body was curled in a near-perfect spiral, like a prayer left unfinished. Its tongue had been cleanly removed, and placed between its paws. Its eyes were open. Glass clear. Fixed on the queen's windows. A gardener touched it and vomited up white fur. He died an hour later, screaming about a mouth filled with leaves and teeth. Isabella said nothing. But she had the fox buried in the garden. Not beneath stone. Not with a blessing. She took the tongue, and kept it in a jar. A week later, her roses doubled in bloom. The affair became a legend. Nobles whispered, she takes him into her chamber through mirrors. Priests muttered, she feeds him something not made for men. Even the king, now fevered and lost, once asked, is he the father of your child? She leaned close. Touched his lips. What makes you think it will have a father? Mortimer changed too. His eyes began to dull. His dreams filled with water and spirals. He once woke and tried to speak, but only thorns fell from his mouth. He told no one but Isabella. She kissed his palm and said, it means she's near. Don't let her kiss you. She bites what she loves. The fox came back. Not truly. But in dreams. Isabella began to see it pacing the halls, a shadow with no sound, its tongue wagging behind it like a red ribbon. It would sit outside her door. Watching. Waiting. Once, it spoke. Not in words. In laughter. Her own laughter. Played back, wrong. Slowed down. Stretched into something that didn't know it had once been human. The queen began to sleep in the garden. Naked. Covered in leaves. Surrounded by black roses. When Mortimer found her, she was whispering to the ground. The roots are listening, she said. The deeper we bury it, the sweeter it will bloom. He didn't ask what it was. He just laid beside her. And for the first time, neither of them dreamed. Chapter 13, The Host Rises. They used to say no queen walked the Roman road alone. But that was before they met this queen. It was All Hallows Eve, the year the harvest failed. The air hung thick with rotting fruit and burnt wood. The sun died fast that day, sinking like a drowned thing, and never quite finished setting. By dusk, only the queen walked the ancient road, barefoot, dressed in black. No torch. No escort. Only silence. And the scent of wet iron and apple blossoms. The road had not been walked in centuries. Once, it led to Londinium, now it led nowhere, swallowed by bramble and earth. But Isabella knew its lines. She had seen them drawn in a book bound in tongues. The Roman stones were warm beneath her soles. As if they remembered. As if they were waiting. Guards followed, at a distance. 4 of them. Assigned by the king. Not loyal, but obedient. They laughed at first. Mocked the pageantry. called her witch, widow, wild bitch behind their helmets. But an hour into the walk, the laughter stopped. Because they began to hear hooves. Not many. Not fast. But constant. Click. 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 Behind them. Around them. Inside them. But when they turned, there was no one. The horses never came. But the fever did. One guard collapsed mid-step. He clutched his chest and screamed, "They are riding inside my lungs." His eyes burst, not from pressure, but from maggots that poured from the ducts like milk. The second fled into the forest, tearing off his armor, weeping, shouting, "She's not walking alone. She's never been alone." They found him 2 days later in a hollow tree, body curled, mouth sewn shut with black thread that no blade could cut. The last 2 guards walked with her the rest of the way. But they did not speak again. They were burning inside, and the smoke only leaked from their mouths when they thought no one saw. And Isabella? She walked calmly. Gracefully. Eyes half-lidded. Lips parted. She whispered words in a tongue older than England. Every few paces, she dropped something. A tooth. Not hers. A ribbon soaked in infant blood. A coin that pulsed, warm and wet, long after it hit the ground. The wind picked up, but only around her. The sky split, not with lightning, but with a sound like breath caught in a throat. And then they came. The wild host. First, smell, moss, rot, sweat, smoke, sulfur, horsehair. Then movement, shadows shifting wrong against the trees. Then the sound, hundreds of hooves, but muffled, as though galloping through deep water. Then the eyes, too many, too low to the ground. And then the bodies, spectral. War-torn. Bound in armor and rags and fire. Not men. Not horses. Things between. Knights with hollow faces. Mounts with too many legs. And behind them, a woman on a throne of ribs, holding a child that pulsed with inward light. Isabella did not run. She knelt. The road around her cracked and bled sap. The host passed her, not around her, but through her, and her dress turned grey with age, then black again. When she stood, she was weeping. But her eyes were dry. And the last guard collapsed behind her, his chest opened not by blade, but by pressure, as though something had crawled out of him and left behind only skin. She returned to the palace before dawn. Her feet were uncut. Her hands were clean. Her shadow now walked a few steps behind her, holding a sword. When she passed the stables, every horse reared. And in the Queen's garden, every rose turned its face toward her. No one asked what she had done. But the Archbishop was found dead 2 days later. His spine spiraled like a corkscrew, and his mouth stuffed with dried leaves. On his chest, a single word carved with something hot. Host. Chapter 14, The Howling Parliament. No decree announced it. No scroll bore the words. But still, it was true. The king no longer ruled. Edward sat on the throne, but it did not recognize him. He spoke, but his voice did not echo in the hall. His proclamations were signed, and then blotted into inkless stains, as if parchment itself refused to remember his commands. He summoned knights. They came to the gate, but would not enter. He sent for loyal lords. Only silence came back. The nobles had begun to gather elsewhere. Not in rebellion. In relocation. They came, quietly, to Isabella's garden. At night. Unarmed. Bareheaded. They stood under the moonlight among the black roses and said nothing, until the Queen stepped from the trees barefoot, eyes half-lidded, skin damp as if kissed by fog. "We don't want a war," one baron whispered. "We want a future." She offered no promise. Only a smile. And when they left, each of them bore a mark on their wrist, a faint spiral of dried wax. One lord swore it hissed in the cold. In Parliament, the air had changed. Not the politics. Not the law. The air. Stale. Hot. Wrong. Torches flickered in stillness. Scrolls cracked when unrolled. One steward swore the benches breathed when no one Saturday. The Archbishop of York stood to condemn the Queen. His mouth filled with fur. He choked on it and fell, claws embedded in his throat. No one touched the body. A monk began to write. Not a chronicler. A gardener from Canterbury who'd gone mad after seeing the Queen sleepwalk through the orchard, speaking Latin backward. He wrote for 3 days. On scraps. On walls. On his skin. Before he died, he spoke his last sentence to the abbot. The Queen rides with wolves we cannot see. And they are growing hungry. He bled from his ears. The parchment he'd written on was gathered and burned. The smoke would not rise, it slid along the ground, toward London. In the King's Court, laughter had ceased. Even Gaveston's memory had faded. The jester fled after seeing Isabella walk past a mirror, and the reflection turned to look at him. He was found a week later, blindfolded, whispering riddles into a well. Only one was recorded. What walks like a woman, eats like a god, and dreams in a voice that doesn't belong to this world. The wolves howled first in Essex. A village reported seeing 20, maybe more, all with human eyes. They circled the local manor, then vanished. A farmer shot one. It fell. It bled milk. By morning, the farmer's throat had been devoured from the inside out, no wound, no teeth marks. Just a cavity where his song had lived. His wife claimed the Queen visited her that night and said, "We must clear the path for the new fire." And in London? Edward sat in Parliament and found himself alone. The Lords had left quietly, in pairs and silence. Even the guards stood at the edges now, eyes averted, hands twitching at their sides, as if waiting for a command they'd already heard in a dream. A single crow perched on the throne's high beam. It did not move. It did not blink. When Edward finally rose to speak, the wind slammed the doors shut. And somewhere in the rafters, something began to howl. Not animal. Not human. Something that remembered both, and hated both. The Queen never entered Parliament. But her scent lingered in the corridors. Damp earth. Rosemary. Blood and candle smoke. Scrolls curled when she passed. Tapestries fluttered without wind. And when a steward dropped his pen, it rolled into a corner and came back with a bite mark. No battle was declared. But the throne now belonged to her. The wolves had taken no blood. Only loyalty. And loyalty, as everyone knew, was much harder to exorcise. Chapter 15, The Fall of the Fool. There was no crown on his head when they dragged him from the palace. No resistance. No war cry. Only Edward's silence. And the sound of his nails scratching across the polished marble floor, as if he were trying to stay attached to the throne by friction alone. He was taken at night. No procession. No witnesses. Only wolves in the distance, and a wind that smelled like salt and vinegar and blood gone sweet. They locked him in a stone cell beneath Berkeley Castle. Not because it was secure, but because the walls were thick, and the screaming would not carry far. They assigned 2 guards. Both men deaf. The Queen's instructions were clear. He will beg. Let no one answer. He screamed for the first time 3 hours in. Not in pain, in prayer. "Jesu. Jesu, save me, I didn't know." Then it changed. "Isabella. Tell them to stop. It's not me they want, it's you." The guards couldn't hear the words. But they saw the shadows begin to move in the torchlight. Not lengthen, detach. As if Edward's own shadow had gotten bored and wandered away. By the second day, the scratching began. Not with tools. with fingers. They found blood under his nails, then bone, then blood again. He had scratched circles, spirals, symbols no man recognized, except one, the Queen. Her name was carved into the wall 46 times, in increasingly tight loops. The last carving was in mirror script. No one knew how. He stopped eating. The bread turned moldy in his hand. The wine soured in the goblet before he lifted it. He began to whisper to things in the corner. He called one of them, Mother. He called another, Melusine. Once, the guard swore he was laughing. Not like a king. Like a boy. Like a boy lost in a forest where the trees whispered things he was too young to understand. The Queen sent no message. But she began to wear a new ring, jet and gold, shaped like a serpent eating its tail. She walked lighter now. The air seemed to bend around her. One lord tried to speak her name in court. He choked on his own tongue. The last night of Edward's life, the guards said he began singing. A lullaby. One they didn't recognize. But the stone hummed along. The walls bled condensation that smelled of milk and wax. One guard vomited. The other fainted. When they returned the next morning, the king was gone. Not vanished, dead. But there were no wounds. No blood. No bruises. No broken bone. His body was stiff. His eyes wide. His mouth open in a perfect circle, lips blackened as if he'd been screaming for days, but his throat was clean. The walls of the cell were completely covered in scratch marks. No inch of stone left untouched. Some in Latin. Some in French. Some in a script that pulsed when stared at too long. And one phrase repeated dozens of times. The crown sits now on the womb. Isabella was told at dusk. She simply nodded. At last, she said. The throne is empty. That night, thunder broke without lightning. The horses wept foam. The cats refused to sleep indoors. And in the Queen's private chamber, a midwife screamed and dropped her lamp, claiming she saw a second queen, coiled around the bedpost, whispering in an unborn child's voice. There was no child in the room. Only Isabella. Smiling. Chapter 16, A Queen Without Chains. There had never been a queen like her. Not in living memory. Not in legend. They sang her name in the streets. Painted her likeness in oils and blood. Knelt as she passed, not out of loyalty, but reverence. Because everyone felt it now. Isabella was no longer merely a woman. She was something between breath and storm. She ruled through her son. But the crown turned when she moved. Edward III wore the throne, but Isabella carried the weight. Ministers answered to her. Ambassadors watched her lips, not the boys. And Mortimer, her lover and co-ruler, held audiences in her shadow. She smiled more now. Spoke less. Her silences were like weather, thick, pressurized, impossible to ignore. One bishop said. She says nothing, and yet I feel my soul adjust. He resigned the next morning and walked into the sea. She began to dress in light colors. White. Bone. Ivory. Veils so thin they whispered as she moved. She radiated something angelic, almost sacred. But the animals still recoiled. Birds refused to nest near her chamber. Cats hissed and ran. One hound followed her once and chewed through its own leg that night, whimpering in its sleep. The dog died with its eyes open, staring at a spot no one else could see. Her reflection began to change. Not constantly. Just enough to notice. In mirrors, she always smiled. Even when she wasn't. In still water, her lips sometimes moved without sound. One maid swore she saw the Queen's reflection turn its head, just slightly, even as Isabella looked the other way. Another said she caught the reflection blinking. When the Queen's real eyes did not. The queen noticed too. But she never reacted. She simply began to avoid mirrors after sunset. She bathed in steam-thick chambers with no glass. She gave away her silver combs and began to brush her hair by memory alone. But some nights, the whisper came back, just at the edge of sleep. You are no longer her. You are the root. You are the husk. She walks behind your skin now. She never answered it. But her dreams began to bleed at the edges. Mortimer asked her once, "What do you see when you look at yourself?" She kissed his hand and said, "Nothing that belongs to you." That night, he dreamed of a white throne built of open mouths, all singing her name. The queen walked without guards now. Through Parliament. Through gardens. Through cathedrals where the crucifixes had started to weep sap instead of blood. She passed between people like mist, sometimes seen, sometimes felt. And when a foreign emissary bowed too slowly, his back snapped. They said it was gout. But the steward who found the body said the man's last words were, "She saw herself in me, and hated what she saw." Isabella no longer prayed. She visited the chapel weekly, knelt in perfect posture, and closed her eyes. But she spoke to no god the priests recognized. And when they anointed her with oil, their hands blistered. One bishop confessed he heard a voice say, "She doesn't need heaven. She remembers before it." And still, the people loved her. They brought her roses. Named their daughters after her. Left coins in spirals at the palace gate. But the black roses had begun to bloom again. And her reflection, in the polished blade she carried at her waist, now moved just a breath out of sync. She was no longer a queen in chains. She had broken them. Melted them. Forged something new from their ash. But freedom is never without price. And some nights, when the palace was quiet, the mirror in her chamber fogged from the inside.
The story may end here, but the darkness never sleeps. Like this video to keep the shadows stirring. Share your whispers in the comments. Your voice shapes the next nightmare. And subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Gothic Hour Stories and Mysteries, where every tale lingers and every soul leaves a mark. The Gothic Hour awaits.